Good evening, everyone. So this is the shorter version of my report regarding literacy, ideology, and the politics of schooling. I'm Apple Casey Vera, your presenter for tonight. So let's start with the contents of Chapter 6. So it divided into 4 topics. So the first one will be instrumental ideology and literacy, then interaction ideology and literacy, then reproductive ideology and pedagogy of critical literacy, and the last one, Paulo Freire and the notion of critical literacy. Okay, so in this case, literacy becomes the new admission ticket for the poor in their attempt to enter an economy that regards them as a second-class citizens. Okay, so let's start with instrumental ideology and literacy. What is this all about? Okay, first, so it is a culture of positivism. So the major premises of instrumental ideology are drawn from the logic and method of inquiry associated with the natural sciences, especially the principles of prediction, efficiency, and technical control derived from 18th century natural science. So underlying this interest is the assumption that there is unitary scientific method which recognizes no distinction between the physical world and the human world. So at the center of this ideology is an operational view of theory and knowledge. So another central to the logic of instrumental ideology, the view of theory is the notion that all social relations shall be subject to quantification, since the book of nature, including human nature, is held to be written in the language of mathematics. So, knowledge in this view is seen as objective outside of the existence of the knowledge and the subject to the demands of exact and precise formulation. So another concept for instrumental ideology, it has to be assessed not only by the assumptions that govern the questions it raises, but also by the issues it ignores the questions it does not raise. So, for example, it it's it's uh, insistence on the definition of truth that uh, it is synonymous with empirical verification and objective methodological inquiry. So it renders it powerless to identify the normative interests that shape its view of theory and social inquiry. And another is the silence regarding the normative grounding of knowledge results in a discourse that suppresses the notion of ethics and the value of history. So, since knowledge in this perspective is valued for its utility and practical application, there is little room for questions concerning the ethical nature and consequences of the use of knowledge. So in this view, it is deeply ingrained in the ideology of schooling that can be seen in the powerful support given by the educators to competency-based systems of instruction. So behaviorist model of pedagogy and the various versions of systems theory approaches to curriculum theory and policy development. We have two basic ideologically related notions of reading that dominate this tradition. So the first notion, it speaks to the needs and interests of students from the dominant class. So meaning, reading in this instance is defined through an emphasis on mastering certain forms of knowledge. So aligned with those who would argue that reading is a process of understanding. So this group reduces the notion of understanding to learning content deemed appropriate to the well-educated citizens. So on the other hand, the second notion is geared primarily to working class students whose cultural capital is considered less compatible and thus inferior in terms of both complexity and values with the knowledge and values of the dominant class. So if the first notion reduces reading to a mode of pedagogy designed to reproduce the values and ideology of the dominant culture, so the second notion moves from an emphasis on reproducing a body of knowledge to an emphasis on teaching and rudimentary process of reading. So, for example, vocabulary skills, word identification, and study skills. So it also expresses, instrumental ideology also expresses itself through a purely formalistic approach to writing, characterized by a strict emphasis on rules, exhortations about what to do or not to do as one writes. So instead of treating writing as a process that is both the medium and product of one's experience in the world, this approach strips writing of its normative and critical dimensions, and it reduces to the learning of skills, so which at the most reductionist level focuses on the mastery of grammatical rules. Okay, so another is interaction, ideology, and literacy. So interaction ideology is situated in interest that contrasts sharply with the notions of prediction, control, and efficiency. At the center of this account is an interest in recovering the subject and the human dimensions of knowledge. So, in instrumental ideology, expresses a view of literacy that posits an dialectical relation between knowledge, skills, and the human subject. In this account, knowledge and skills are given high priority as value-free, objective elements in the literacy process. So similarly, students are relegated to a relatively passive role in the pedagogical process, that is, human agency is ignored. So learning is viewed as a dialectical interaction between the person and the objective world. And the knowledge is in a social construction. So yun yung difference ng interaction sa instrumental. So a curriculum fostering modes of reading and writing that examine moral dilemmas will presumably reach students through the process of cognitive conflict to move on to higher forms of moral reasoning. So the discourse of liberal ideology is deeply ingrained in this perspective, humanistic in tone and social democratic in practice. So it views school as the central agencies for the development of democratic life. So in effect, critical thinking and cognitive development are portrayed as epistemological equivalent of democratic action. So the cognitive development approach focuses primarily on reading as an intellectual process. So language practices become important here to the degree that they exhibit the skills needed to analyze and decode the problems. So the issue of process here is crucial because inherent in this view is the assumption that content is of minor importance. So another is reproductive ideology and pedagogy of critical literacy. whereas instrumental and interactive ideologies view the relation between the individual and society in either highly conservative or unproblematic terms. On the other hand, reproductive ideology views the relation as one step in domination and conflict. So, equally important is the question of why the oppressed do not recognize such structures and why they often participate in reproducing them. So, such approach restricting themselves to analysis of ideologies about education. So, provide a theoretical framework for locating outside of schools the origins of class and gender divisions in their articulation with forms of knowledge, literacy, and pedagogy in the school curriculum. So also, reproductive ideologies argue that schools cannot be understood either in terms of their relation to the wider society or in terms of how they function daily as agencies of social and cultural reproduction unless the complex interplay of power and control is critically analyzed. So it is in this context that the connection between power and culture become important. So meaning culture in this perspective becomes the mediating link between the system of power relations and the process and outcomes that characterize the system of schooling. So knowledge in this perspective is linked to power in terms of the ideology inscribed in its message and content. So rather than simply being transmitted, knowledge functions as a reproductive force that partially serves to locate subjects within the specified boundaries of class, gender, and race. So they demonstrate the need for educators to develop the theory of society in order to understand the complex role of schools plays as agencies designed to mediate and sustain the logic of the state and the imperatives of capital. So in doing so, reproductive theories have helped us to recognize that the production of knowledge and classroom social relations represent significant moment in the process of social denomination. Okay, and the last topic, Paulo Freire and the notion of critical literacy. So, according to him, um, uh, moves beyond this theoretical possession by viewing culture in dialectical terms. So, Freire has defined and uses theory of literacy to critique the process of cultural reproduction, while simultaneously linking the notion of cultural production to the process of critical reflection and social action. So his critique of mainstream literacy approaches provides the theoretical landscape against which to understand his notion of literacy as a model of radical cultural production. And also, Freire moves from critique to cultural production to social action by linking these notions of culture and power within the context of a radically informed pedagogy. So, central to Freire's approach to literacy, his notion of conscientization. So, this term refers to the interface of critical reflection and action as two separate but interconnected moments in the process of individual and collective emancipation. And he believes that the role of the literacy educator is to enter into dialogue within the people around themes that speak to the concrete situations and life experiences that inform their daily lives. So literacy in this sense is not merely linked to the notion of relevance. So instead, it is grounded in a view of human knowledge and social practice that recognize the importance of using the cultural capital of the oppressed to authenticate the voice and modes of knowing they use to negotiate with the dominant society. So, thank you. Keep safe always, and God bless us. Good night.